Hello, this is Coach Holmes, and today we got a lesson on basic geometry. Now we're going to get started on the geometry part of the class. And so, in order to get this, we have to understand the basics of geometry. Okay? So, first off, what are some of the definitions? So, like, we have point, line, ray, segment, plane. What does that even mean? What is the point? What is a ray exactly? I'm about to explain. A point is a location represented as a dot. Okay? So for example, on the side here, if we have like a simple dot right here, that's a point. That's called point A, by the way. Okay? Any type of point is going to be abbreviated by a capital letter. Okay? So in this case, it's not a lowercase, it's going to be capitalized. So that way we can distinctly tell whether it's a point or just a variable. Because typically variables are described in lowercase letters. Points and anything else is going to be capitalized. Now a line, we kind of know what a line is, but mathematically speaking, is a straight mark with no endpoints. Okay? A straight line, a straight mark with no endpoints. And the way we indicate no endpoints is by having the arrows here. Because that tells me, even though I draw from here to here, this line is going to keep on going. So a line is never ending in geometry. Okay? A line does not end in geometry. Well, some of you may be thinking, well, doesn't a line end? Yes, but there are different types. For example, a ray is a line with one endpoint. One endpoint, not point. So example here, if I have one endpoint right here, and I keep going, this is a ray. Okay? Basically, a ray is any line that has at least one endpoint. Now, a segment is a line with two endpoints. Okay? So typically, it's going to have 2 points where it ends. Okay? It's not going to keep going in both directions. While a ray keeps going in one direction, and a line continues in both directions. Okay? So there are different types of lines, but how you distinguish one from another is by how many endpoints that it has. Now, a plane is completely different, okay? Plane is a flat surface that extends forever. Okay? So typically a plane doesn't really have an endpoint, it doesn't have edges or anything. But typically when you draw it, you're going to draw edges. But you got to keep in mind with the planes that it continues in both directions, in all directions. And it's a flat surface. Okay? There's no hills, there's no bump, it's just flat. It's kind of like the floor, how the floor is flat. That's being one example of a plane, but it doesn't have edges though. Okay? So like a rectangle is not typically a plane because a rectangle has edges around it. Planes don't have edges. They just keep on going. Now, when you have multiple segments or multiple lines, rays and planes, it's important to identify them. It's kind of like naming them. It's kind of like how every single one of us has a name. You know, for example, my name is Holmes. That's my last name. Okay? Some of you have different last names. That's how we identify one another. We identify each other based off of names. We can still identify segments, lines, rays, and planes in a specific way. So there are all ways that we identify segments. For example, so as far as identifying this segment, my two endpoints is A and B. So I identify as A, B with a line over it, just like that. Just a nice even line. Now, you could say BA. That could be the same thing. So it could be either or. It could be either or. But typically, more often than not, people do it alphabetically in order. Okay? I'm just gonna draw dashes so that way we separate it. Okay? Now, a line, this is a line. Okay? So real quick, this is segment. This is line. So how do we identify a line? Well, we kind of do it the same way for a segment, but the biggest difference is instead of it just a normal line, I'm going to put arrows on both ends. And what this tells me is that whatever for point A, it actually keeps going, and for point B, it keeps going. Now, well, what's the difference between the segment? That tells me it stops at A, and this tells me it stops at B. So if it has the arrow, it keeps on going. Now, could we identify this as BA? Well, absolutely we can. Because, again, they're going in both directions. So really, as long as we cover the entire line, as long as we cover its entirety, we're still in good shape. But again, more often than not, people will identify as line AB, just because it's alphabetically in order. Now, this right here, we have a ray. Now, how do I identify ray? Well, same thing, A, B. But I'm going to put the arrow over the B. Because if you notice, it doesn't just stop at B, it keeps on going. Okay? So I want to identify as a B. Now, could we possibly, now if you think about it, could we possibly say BA ray? No. We cannot call that BA ray. Because what that tells me is that the end point is at B, and while it does go through A, it keeps on going. Which is not really the case. It doesn't keep going through A, it only continues on in through B. Okay? So normally you will see it like this, A, B. Ray will be the one time where you really have to keep in mind what the endpoint is. Okay? As long as it doesn't have an arrow, it's an endpoint. If it has the arrow, it keeps on going. Now, how do we identify ABC? How do we identify this plane? Well, we identify it as plane ABC. So really, we just have to give it 3 points. We just have to have 3 points on the plane in order to identify it. Now, does it necessarily have to be ABC? Does it have to be in that order? No, because there's nothing really telling us alphabetically where it is. Because remember, a point is just a location. We identify the point with a letter, but again, there's not really any sort of way to say, well, this letter goes first, this letter goes second. Not really. Just, again, more often than not, people identify it as in alphabetical order. Now, another thing that we do got to keep in mind is what's coplanar and collinear. Coplanar are points that are on the same plane. okay? Any point that is on the same plane is coplanar, okay? That means it's all together in the same plane. They all share the same plane. Now, collinear, it's kind of similar to coplanar, but the only difference is that it has to do with a line. So really, collinear is points that are on the same line. That's where the big difference comes from. Coplanar has to do with being on a plane. Collinear has to do with being on the line. Okay? Now, just a sample down here, what we want to do is we're going to identify, I want y'all to identify coplanar, should be an A, and collinear. Okay? So for example, plane, and again, it could be any sort of letter, just as long as it's on the plane. But I'm going to say AVX. Plane AVX. Now we can say plane AVC, but I'm not typically worried about it. So for this particular plane, I have A, V, and X. Obviously, because that's how we identify it. But notice how I also have C. Let me put commas in between. I don't like how I put the comma in the X, so bear with me. We also have P and W. Now, the 2 points that are not coplanar is M and B, because they're both distinctly outside of the plane, okay? And nothing, because remember, the plane is flat, so it can't just curve and go around and just happen to go through B. It's flat. So B is never going to be, in this case, is not coplanar. Now, collinear, now we got a couple of different lines. We have a line and we have a segment. So, and if you notice here, see how there's a point and then there's just nothing and then there's a line all of a sudden? It's basically a line going through the plane, okay? So at this point, it goes through the plane. It just, and we know the line's there, it just happens to be behind it, okay? Now, so for example, let's say we look at line MB, okay? There's 3 different points that share the same line. We have M, B, and V. Okay? I'm going to put a box just so that we know what the answer is. So for line MB, the 3 collinear points is M, B, V. Now C is not collinear of M, B because it's not on the line. But it is part of the segment of AC. And what's collinear to AC? Well, we have A, V, C in that order. Okay? Now, W is not collinear to AC. Neither is it collinear to MB, or line MB. Now, so non-collinear points will be samples like W and P, for both cases at least. For both cases, of course. But if you're asked a question, well, what's non-collinear to line MB? You could obviously say, you can say A. It is a segment, but you can definitely say A because it's not part of the line MB. X is not collinear to MB, but it's also not collinear to AC, the segment. So it's even more obvious that X is not non-collinear. Okay? So a lot of it is a lot of it today is being able to identify different lines, segments, and rays. How do we identify them? But also, how do we distinguishedly know which one's coplanar and which one's collinear? Okay? Thank you, and have a good day.